Hello and welcome back to my channel. Thank you guys very much for tuning in. I hope you're all doing well, and I hope that you all had a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. It's been 6 months since I made a video, and I wasn't sure if I was going to continue doing this. When I first started making videos back in May, I realized just how large of an undertaking it was going to be and realized that I was going to have great difficulty integrating content creation into my already busy schedule. But I set a New Year's resolution for myself and said that I'm going to resume creating videos and I'm going to aim to create one video per week as I had originally intended. We'll see how it goes. In this video, we're going to pick up exactly where we left off in the last video. And if you haven't seen my last few videos, you need to go watch those. They detail a linear recounting of social justice activism in the 21st century. So far, we've discussed critical theory, and we've discussed the ideologies that are derived from critical theory, including feminist theory, critical race theory, and queer theory. We also discussed how women have extensive private communication networks in the digital realm, including Facebook groups, extensive group chats, and even dedicated mobile apps. We also discussed how around the year 2015, feminist theory and critical race theory themed propaganda began to funnel its way into women's private communication networks. In this video, we're going to begin our long process of uncovering the identities of the parties responsible for funneling those materials into women's spaces. A quick word of warning, this video is going to be information rich and I'm going to be moving fairly quickly. If you need to rewind and come back to certain sections of this video, that's totally fine, but hopefully you can stay with me and that won't be necessary. Now, it's no big secret to anyone that America has undergone some radical transformative changes over the course of the past decade. But unbeknownst to many, these changes, including the ones that have been brought about by social justice activism, have not been organic or grassroots. These changes have been artificial and coordinated and as part of a larger agenda, an agenda that's meant to transform the entire world. It's that very agenda that we're going to be covering in this video. I'm going to be reading from my own written work on this subject, and without further ado, we're just going to dive right in. In 1983, the United Nations created the Brundtland Commission, or the World Commission on Environment and Development, to mobilize global action towards what had come to be referred to as sustainable development. Sustainable development is defined as an organizing principle that aims to meet human development goals while also enabling natural systems to provide necessary natural resources and ecosystem services to humans. The desired result is a society where living conditions and resources meet human needs without undermining the planetary integrity and stability of the natural system. In other words, sustainable development purports to be the process of guiding the world towards a utopic balance between economic growth and development, the protection of the environment, and social evolution. It purports to be centered around finding solutions for what are commonly believed to be the world's most pressing and seemingly unsolvable issues, including poverty, world hunger, conflict, inequality, lack of access to quality education, environmental degradation, climate change, and the like, and it aims to unite the nations of the world in addressing these issues. The Commission also focuses its attention in the areas of population, the loss of species and genetic resources, energy, industry, and human settlements, declaring all of these are connected and cannot be treated in isolation from one another. In 1987, the Brundtland Commission published a book titled Our Common Future, also known as the Brundtland Report, which first laid the beginnings of a multilateral framework for steering the world towards this imagined utopia. The Commission called upon the leaders of the world to work collectively towards cultivating sustainable development and called upon them to re-examine the critical issues of environment and development and to formulate innovative, concrete, and realistic action proposals to deal with them, to strengthen international cooperation on environment and development, and to assess and propose new forms of cooperation that can break out of existing patterns and influence policies and events in the direction of needed change, and to raise the level of understanding and commitment to action on the part of individuals, voluntary organizations, businesses, institutes, and governments. In other words, the groundwork for creating a new, sustainable order of the world had been laid. In 1992, the United Nations held the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, where the guidelines laid out by the Brundtland Commission were translated into a functional global agenda known as Agenda 21. This was a comprehensive action plan for the UN, other multilateral organizations, and individual governments around the world, intended to be implemented at the local, national, and global levels, with the chief aim being to achieve, quote, global sustainable development by the year 2000. The agenda was technically non-binding, but member states were expected to work diligently towards the implementation of these goals, with each individual government being expected to translate the goals into legislation, and each government being responsible for providing the Council with periodic progress reports. By and large, these various governments and organizations began integrating Agenda 21 into their respective legislations and policies and began working towards the realization of its goals. But progress towards the goals proved to be inconsistent, and 8 years later, the goals had still not been met. In the year 2000, this agenda was renewed, revised, and renamed to the Millennium Development Goals, and an effort was made to inspire a fresh sense of urgency and enthusiasm among stakeholders. The 4 sections of Agenda 21 were modified to 8 specific goals, and work towards these goals continued, albeit at the same inconsistent pace, for the next decade and a half. The agenda seemed to be in limbo, in fact, until the year 2015, when in September that year, a momentous event occurred. After assessing the progress towards the Millennium Development Goals and deciding that the world had fallen woefully short of attaining sustainable development, the United Nations, in joint collaboration with various NGOs, including the World Economic Forum, outlined and proposed a new agenda, an agenda called the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, also known as the Post-2015 Development Goals. This agenda was essentially a reimagining of Agenda 21, but on steroids. The new agenda contained 17 Sustainable Development Goals, encompassing 169 specific targets with 232 indicators, which are used to measure the progress towards the goals, and these numbers themselves are significant. If there's space in this series to do so, we're going to cover the significance of these numbers in a later video. Learning from the various mistakes and missteps of Agenda 21 and the Millennium Development Goals, the UN laid a revamped blueprint for global transformation intended to radically alter nearly every aspect of our world. Indeed, if there ever were a great work in the history of man, this was it. This agenda was quietly adopted by 193 nations, including the United States of America, without any common citizen voting for it, and without the majority of any nation's citizens being aware that it even existed. All of the nations that have adopted this agenda have mutually agreed to work towards achieving the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, by the year 2030. The 17 SDGs are as follows. Number 1, no poverty. End poverty in all its forms everywhere by the year 2030. Number 2, zero hunger. Create a world free of hunger by 2030. Number 3, good health and well-being. Ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. Number 4, quality education. Ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. Number 5, gender equality. achieve gender equality by 2030 and empower all women and girls. Number 6, clean water and sanitation. Ensure access to water and sanitation for all. Number 7, affordable and clean energy. Ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy. Number 8, decent work and economic growth. Promote inclusive and sustainable economic growth, employment, and decent work for all. Number 9, industry, innovation, and infrastructure. Build resilient infrastructure, promote sustainable industrialization, and foster innovation. Number 10, reduce inequality. Reduce social and economic inequality within and among nations. Number 11, sustainable cities and communities. Make cities inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. Number 12, responsible consumption and production. Ensure sustainable patterns of consumption and production. Number 13, climate action. Take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. Number 14, life below water. Conserve and sustainably use the oceans, seas, and marine resources. Number 15, life on land. Sustainably manage forests, halt and reverse land degradation, and halt biodiversity loss. Number 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. Promote just, peaceful, and inclusive societies. And finally, number 17, partnership for the goals. Revitalize the global partnership for sustainable development. As previously mentioned, in addition to the 17 goals, each individual goal has a set of 8 to 12 specific targets, or 169 targets in total, with 1 to 4 indicators per target for 232 indicators in total. These targets cover practically every facet of human life on planet Earth. They touch the global economy, the environment, agriculture, healthcare, education, energy, reproduction, and everything else under the sun. Where the UN once had a loose framework for guiding the world on a general path towards sustainable development, the UN now had an all-encompassing action plan for transformative change that targeted nearly every facet of human society and material existence. An agenda intended to be adopted by nearly all nations, with each working towards the creation of what would ultimately become a new, interconnected world, a global form of government, and a completely new order of society. Making note of where Agenda 21 had fallen flat, special emphasis had been placed this time around on holding stakeholders accountable to the fulfillment of this agenda, and a special Sustainable Development Goal, SDG number 17, was created to bolster and revitalize collaboration between nations, organizations, institutions, and everyone else working towards the fulfillment of these goals. Shortly after Agenda 2030 was adopted, a large-scale, multifaceted implementation effort was rolled out to begin edging the world towards the attainment of this agenda, a task that was adopted by nearly every institution in the Western world. Where the will to implement Agenda 21 had been spotty at best, it appears that a change of heart occurred in 2015, and Agenda 2030 was adopted with passionate enthusiasm as individual governments, corporations, organizations, and institutions immediately began translating the goals into national legislation or corporate policy, developing their own unique plans for action, and even establishing their own budgets. Never before in human history had such a large collective of national governments, subnational authorities, corporations, politicians, organizations, institutions, media networks, and state and local actors of all shapes and sizes work towards attaining a common set of goals. The UN's website states individual people, universities, governments, institutions, and organizations of all kinds are working separately on one or more of these goals at the same time, and as we shall see through the progression of the series, it's not merely the aforementioned entities who are working towards promoting and or achieving these goals. It's nearly every entity in America. It's the school systems, it's virtually all major corporations, it's many entertainers and the entertainment industry as a whole, it's big tech, and it's even many of the churches. As previously mentioned, the cooperation of most of these entities is its own sustainable development goal, SDG number 17, Partnership for the Goals. This agenda is now being reflected from every surface of our society. It's in our curriculums, it's in our films and television shows, it's virtually everywhere, and this agenda is the reason why everything around you is suddenly changing at such a remarkable rate. Most of the proposals in Agenda 2030 seem lofty and benevolent enough on the surface, right? After all, who in their right mind would oppose a solution to global hunger or poverty? But what do these goals consist of exactly? For example, you may be wondering how the UN plan on eradicating global hunger and poverty, and what specific barriers do the UN identify as being responsible for these issues? The answer, of course, is fairly complicated. In their discussion paper, Gender Equality and Sustainable Development, a Pathways Approach, the UN write, the decades since the 1950s have seen huge growth across many indicators of production and consumption. The global economy has increased by more than a factor of 15, and real world gross domestic product grew from $2 trillion in 1965 to $28 trillion in 1995. This has depended for the most part on a development model focused on market-led economic growth under late capitalism. It is supported by powerful narratives deeply entrenched among many international agencies and market actors that depict economic growth as the core goal and market-led approaches as the best way to achieve this. Such narratives have co-developed with patterns of production and consumption generally geared towards increasing monetary accumulation. Hyperconsumption and materialistic lifestyles are encouraged. Neoliberal policies and logics emphasize the pursuit of private profits by firms and individuals in markets left as free as possible from state involvement. Business competition and free trade are encouraged nationally, regionally, and globally, but monopolistic practices are left largely uncurbed. There is increased financialization of many resources and sectors of the economy, and trade and speculation in those financialized resources. While there is obviously variation between countries, regions, and sectors, much of this lies within the broad parameters of a market-oriented neoliberal growth model. Increasingly, though, the economic sustainability of such pathways is in question. Financial crisis and recession taking hold in many countries and sending shock waves around a globalized world have laid bare the risks and vulnerabilities, the bubble-like and boom-bust tendencies inherent to financialized market models, which undermine their viability even on their own terms. The fruits of this growth have also been deeply unequal. As GDP has grown, the economic disparities between countries and regions and within individual societies have increased. The poorest 20% of the world's population control only 2% of the global income, while the world's most rapidly growing economies, including the rising powers of Asia, South Africa, and Latin America, have also seen rapid increases in inequality. Inequality itself threatens economic sustainability, fueling unrest and conflict and undermining the stability, level playing field, and consumer demand on which growth relies. These statements are not without a grain of truth, of course, and many of the assertions and proposals made by the UN are at least partially founded in truth. It's only upon closer examination that the full picture begins to come into stark focus. According to the agenda as outlined by SDG number 10, or reducing inequality within and among nations, It's actually the responsibility of wealthy nations to bolster impoverished nations, and the UN have outlined a plan of action whereby developed nations like the US are going to begin redistributing their wealth and resources to developing nations. The UN also regard mass migration as a driver that will help close the disparities between nations, saying, quote, "Migration is a powerful driver of sustainable development for migrants and their communities, bringing significant skills, strengthening the labor force, investment and cultural diversity, and contributing to improving the lives of communities in their country of origin through the transfer of skills and financial resources." The UN likewise believe that certain economic systems are unsustainable, with capitalism in particular being a favored target. In the same paper on gender equality and sustainable development, the UN state, quote, "Mainstream models of capitalist growth rely on the exploitation of natural resources as if these were unlimited, and on externalizing the environmental costs of production, such as pollution and the release of greenhouse gases. The capitalist market economy drives the constantly intensifying use of human, social, and natural resources in a vicious cycle of growth in which hyper-resource extraction, production, and consumption reinforce each other. In order to increase profits, capitalist production shifts social and ecological cost onto private households and local communities, or onto nature in pathways that rely on and perpetuate gender inequality. It is clear from an analysis on the literature on the SDGs that the UN intend to reimagine most of the key structures and institutions in our world, to usher in profound systemic change and to move our society along a pathway that they frequently refer to as, quote, green transformation. I'll attempt to provide a quick summary of some of the UN's proposals, but it is beyond the scope of this series to attempt a deeper examination on each of the Sustainable Development Goals. It's the duty of each person watching this to research these goals for themselves and to draw their own conclusions, and I strongly urge all of you to do that. The UN want to regulate and restrict what we're allowed to eat and drink, and they specifically want to move the world away from meat consumption. They have also rolled out a multi-pronged engagement campaign to challenge narratives, norms, and attitudes related to meat consumption. Now, engagement is a term that you will see crop up again and again while researching this agenda. The purpose of engagement is fairly straightforward. If you wish to eradicate certain behaviors or practices, you must necessarily eradicate the beliefs and attitudes that give rise to such behaviors. And this is achieved by engaging with and challenging people on the relevant issues. The UN want to restrict travel and want to regulate what we're allowed to use as transportation. They specifically want to move away from fossil fuels, but they also want to move away from large commutes in general. The UN wish to consolidate and contain most of the population within major cities, and the UN are working alongside the larger scientific community and various corporations within the tech industry to realize what have come to be termed as, quote, smart cities. The UN also appear to want to designate entire states in the US as green spaces and as, quote, no travel zones. In a measure to reduce the carbon footprint, the UN want to regulate and limit how much electricity we're allowed to use in our homes, and they want our homes to be fitted with technology that rations our use of electricity. The UN are particularly interested in population growth and human fertility, and they propose many solutions to incentivize and reward women for not bearing children. They want to create an economy that incentivizes childlessness, and they have rolled out an engagement campaign that is intended to challenge our common desire to have children. They likewise believe that women as homemakers is an unsustainable arrangement. The UN want to abolish private property. They want to place restrictions on how much money we're allowed to earn, and they're pushing for what is termed a, quote, solidarity economy that closely resembles socialism. They also wish to create a digital form of currency. They wish to create a digital form of identification that is carried on our person at all times, and they wish to implement a social credit system. They want to make inoculations mandatory, and while they always stop short of acknowledging that inoculations, quote, should be made mandatory, they do explicitly detail proposals to make life nearly impossible for those who refuse to be inoculated. They want to have jurisdiction over our schools' curriculums, and they wish for educators to devote special focus towards issues that align with the Sustainable Development Goals. UNESCO is part of an initiative called Education for Sustainable Development, is working to create a standardized curriculum for schools that integrates the Sustainable Development Goals, and they are pushing to require schools to adopt the curriculum and promote these goals to children as early as kindergarten. The UN also wants all of the world's agricultural and mineral resources under their sole jurisdiction by the year 2030. And the list goes on and on. I'm sure the person watching this video will agree. All of these are radical proposals, to say the very least, and these changes will clearly affect every person in the world in ways that they never imagined were possible. Needless to say, in order for the UN to realize the majority of these goals, it is obviously going to be essential that they first prepare the public consciousness to accept such radical, transformative changes. This necessarily means that long-standing beliefs, dogmas, values, norms, and traditions will have to be challenged and ultimately dismantled. Otherwise, the majority of the public are simply not going to go along with most of these proposals. These proposals conflict with many of the most basic values that the common person stands for. This begs the question, how exactly do the UN plan on preparing the public to accept Agenda 2030? The answer, of course, is in finding innovative ways to challenge and ultimately subvert the status quo, to challenge and undermine not only the beliefs, norms, values, and/or traditions that would inhibit these goals from being realized, but to change our very expectations and outlooks, and to dismantle any of the social hierarchies or power structures fortifying such barriers to sustainability. The UN have expressed a desire to completely change the consciousness of the, quote, global citizen. They wish to move humanity away from all of the customs, traditions, dogmas, and even religions of the world, and they have rolled out a campaign to not only challenge people's affinity for traditional norms and values, but to challenge their very tendency of clinging to individuality and sovereignty, and of viewing cultures, experiences, values, and religions through the lens of a single, fixed perspective. I'm sure most people watching this video will have undoubtedly heard the terms xenophobia, nationalism, monolithic thinking, or other such terms in the past decade. The overuse of these terms in our culture is ultimately part of this engagement effort to undermine adherence to tradition and individual identity. This is where we start to get into the social aspect of Agenda 2030, and this is a subject with many moving parts. Indeed, it will take us many videos to lay bare the foundation of what is at play here, so we're going to start at the beginning. Sustainable Development Goals number 5, gender equality, number 10, reducing inequality, and number 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions, all focus on social justice and systemic change of the order and magnitude originally proposed by critical theorists. The UN pledged that unity, inclusion, equity, and equality will become fully realized facets of global society. They pledged that marginalized groups in particular will be, quote, empowered in proportion to the disadvantages they have historically faced. They pledged that traditional power structures such as, quote, patriarchy will become obsolete, and they vow that discrimination will become a relic of the past. In their approach to, quote, social justice, the UN have adopted the same intersectional approach as originally proposed by feminist and critical race theorists. In the UN's Intersectionality Resource Guide and Toolkit, they state, quote, there is growing recognition that structural barriers and rising inequalities must be addressed in order to achieve the goals of the 2030 Agenda, and the pledge to leave no one behind. Intersectionality can go a long way towards addressing these inequalities. With growing recognition that failure to address complex social systems and identities can obscure or deny the human rights protections due to all, it is crucial to design programs and policies that effectively address not only discrimination based on disability, but the situation of those affected by all forms of compounded and intersecting forms of discrimination. As you will see, in a measure to fulfill SDGs number 5, number 10, and number 16, the UN have taken all of the insights and ideologies of feminist, critical race, and queer theorists and have translated many of these theories and proposals into action plans for systemic change. Beginning in 2016, the UN began enlisting people, organizations, universities, NGOs, corporations, and countless others to begin reorganizing and restructuring society and culture around the aforementioned ideologies and theories, essentially greenlighting and funneling resources towards the enacting of a radical and permanent transformation of society. And companies, corporations, organizations, and even universities began being called upon to boost the upward mobility of select groups of people and to begin integrating, quote, diversity into their policies. In America, the main groups of people to receive such artificial mobility were women, minorities, especially African Americans, and members of the LGBTQ community. Interestingly enough, each group of people were empowered in unique ways that correspond to the proposals made by the academics we discussed in our previous videos. For example, you may recall how queer theorists are particularly keen on reaching adolescents and are pushing for increased queer representation in media as a measure to, quote, normalize LGBTQ perspectives and lifestyles in order to shape the perceptions of children. Well, the UN seemed to have fully embraced these proposals, and their website states, quote, the emergence of a vibrant global LGBTQ movement is notable. However, young LGBTQ people often remain excluded, as is also the case within the broader civil society, from decision-making processes that define their socio-cultural and political environments at local, regional, and international levels. To respond to this, the Office of the UN Secretary General's Envoy on Youth is proud to convene the Queer Youth Dialogues in partnership with ILGA World, the UN Independent Expert on Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity, and the Global Queer Youth Network. The Queer Youth Dialogues constitute a year-long campaign which aim to build the capacity of global LGBTQ youth-led, focused, and organized movements, organizations, and groups. Aligned with this broad goal is the amplification of LGBTQ youth voices through a variety of interdisciplinary, multimedia, and accessible methods. Out of all of the groups being incentivized, however, the UN were particularly keen on, quote, empowering women and girls, and this is the theme that crops up more frequently than any other social issue. The UN seemingly have an obsessive focus on boosting women's mobility, increasing their agency, and increasing their decision-making power. Through an examination of the literature, a startling reason for their obsession comes into focus. The UN regard women as key figures in bringing about the transformative changes that the UN envisions in Agenda 2030, and they believe that women will be invaluable agents in challenging the norms, values, dogmas, and power structures identified by the UN as holding back progress towards Agenda 2030. In their discussion paper, Gender Equality and Sustainable Development, a Pathways Approach, the UN write, quote, women have been and can be central actors in pathways to sustainability and green transformation. What we find is that alternative pathways that move in sustainable directions are possible. They are evident in many places and around many issues and sectors, and they are underpinned by alternative narratives that emphasize not just profit and growth, but the importance of sustainability, inclusivity, and social justice. In these, diverse women and ecologies appear not as victims, but often as agents and alternative socio-natures, agents of change. Typically, these pathways do not rely solely on markets. Instead, they involve different combinations of public, private, and civil society action and institutions, and usually require strong state action. Social movements are key in initiating and demanding these pathways and in shaping forms of collective action that maintain them. Ultimately, feminist movements and collective organizing emerging in diverse ways and places across the world may offer the greatest hope for both challenging unsustainable pathways and charting new ones that lead us in more sustainable, gender-equal directions. We'll be spending a good bit of time in this series examining women's role in Agenda 2030. For now, we're going to take a look at a few more selected quotes from this same paper. In the same paper, the UN outlines the framework for gender equality and how it ties into the larger framework of the post-2015 development goals. Quote, sustainable development is development that ensures human well-being, ecological integrity, gender equality, and social justice, now and in the future. Pursuing sustainable development for all requires upholding human rights principles, widening freedoms, and promoting peace. In combination with a respect for the environment, it requires redressing discrimination and disadvantage at household, local, national, regional, and global levels. This in turn requires redirecting interconnected environmental, economic, social, and political processes, challenging current unsustainable pathways of production, consumption, and distribution, and finding new ones. It requires action and accountability by the state, civil society, the private sector, communities, and individuals, building alliances to transform institutions and power relations and democratize knowledge. In this conceptualization, gender equality is therefore integral to how sustainable development is defined and pursued. We consider gender equality not just in relation to women and men, but also in intersectional terms, attentive to the ways that gender intersects with class, race, and ethnicity, sexuality, place, and other significant axes of difference. The concept of substantive gender equality emphasizes the importance of human rights, capabilities, and the ways these intertwine and overlap. Building on this, we conceptualize multiple dimensions to pursuing gender equality, including A. Redressing socioeconomic disadvantage in the domains of work, well-being, and access to resources. This includes ensuring equal access to decent work and secure livelihoods, the recognition, reduction, and redistribution of unpaid care work, equal access to quality education, health and other social services and public goods, and equal access to and control over resources and their benefits, including ecosystem-based resources. B. Enhancing recognition and dignity. This includes challenging stereotypes around masculinity and femininity, assuring freedom from violence and violations of dignity and security, assurance of bodily integrity and sexual and reproductive health and rights, and recognition and respect for diverse forms of knowledge, production, and application. And finally, C, enhancing equal participation in decision making at all levels. This includes supporting agency, power, and voice in institutions and decision making, building deliberate forms of democracy that can debate sustainability goals and values in inclusive ways, and assuring space for feminist collective action. Gender equality ultimately requires the realization of all human rights. Rights on their own are often not enough. Making them real also requires recognition and respect, power and voice, and challenges to dominant institutions and forms of knowledge. It is here that we see the critical role of collective action and women's mobilization and challenging stereotypes in making states accountable for the realization of rights and in providing alternatives. The UN not only believe that the status of women must change, but they believe our ways of viewing men, women, and their relationship to one another must likewise change. And we will be diving into several of their theories in a later post. For example, we have traditionally regarded women as homemakers, and families have traditionally been powered by a male provider and a female homemaker. For millennia, this was a fixed reality and was taken as a given. The UN believe that this, quote, nuclear family model is not only something that can be modified, but they believe it is unsustainable. They also believe it oppresses women. Like feminist theorists, the UN have taken to conflating homemaking with, quote, unpaid labor, and they believe that unsustainable economic models, including capitalism, largely rely upon the nuclear family model. Their perspective on the matter is quite interesting. Quote, many dominant market-led pathways are also socially and environmentally unsustainable. Indeed, mainstream neoliberal models rely on and thus perpetuate both gender equality and pollution and overexploitation of the environment. In terms of gender, a central dynamic is the way dominant models rely on a separation between productive and reproductive labor, the latter including unpaid and volunteered labor for care, subsistence, and reproduction, much of it carried out by women. While productive labor is valued, capitalist pressures often force wages down. Growth in many areas of industry and commercial agriculture has unfolded along with the feminization of labor. While economic globalization has created employment opportunities for women across various classes, many of these have been provided within and reproduce patterns of discrimination and segregation that are embedded in labor markets. Thus, poorer women undertake work that is seen to be an extension of their traditional gender roles in low retail jobs, domestic service, assembly lines, and labor-intensive agricultural work. Such jobs tend to be characterized by low wages, instability of employment, and poor working conditions. Many are informal. They reinforce the status of women as secondary earners within their households and may remain invisible within the economic system. Even more significantly, capitalist markets and production can continue to function as they do only because they constantly make use of unpaid labor, mostly by women, in caring for children, the sick, and the elderly. Nancy Folber argues that market economies are sustained not by the invisible hand of the market alone, but also by the invisible heart of care. The nature of work that underlies care and the fact that it is unpaid often essentializes women as caregivers. Women's obligations to fulfill these socially prescribed roles not only puts the burden and stress on them, but also limits their opportunities, capabilities, and choices to participate in paid employment outside of their home, with negative consequences for their rights, dignity, and status. This care work, which is essential to reproduce both the labor force and wider communities and societies, is consistently ignored, undervalued, or externalized in capitalist economic models. Throughout the duration of this series, we will periodically examine the UN's published materials related to SDG number 5, gender equality. There's still a lot to unpack here, but for the sake of brevity, we're going to keep this moving. Shortly after Agenda 2030 was adopted in September of 2015, a large-scale outreach program centered around engagement and mobilization of women began. The UN, in collaboration with various universities, corporations, organizations, and even tech giants in Silicon Valley, began a massive outreach campaign focused on exposing women to feminist theory ideologies, as well as exposing women to ideologies in line with the Sustainable Development Goals, albeit often in rebranded forms. Consequently, all of the ideologies we covered in previous videos began to make their way into women's spaces, and thereby began to infect the consciousness of nearly every woman. Even women who had previously never been exposed to such information in any setting was suddenly being bombarded with it, and in a very short amount of time, the propaganda began to have a profound impact on most women's conception of the world and their relationship with men, shifting their personal and collective ambitions in the process. Almost simultaneously, the collective organizing of women began for certain calls to action, and we'll be covering a lot of these in subsequent videos. But it wasn't merely the theories of these scholars that began circulating within women's spaces, it was also certain proposals. The word began to travel within women's spaces that the world was about to change and that a new, equal, interconnected form of society was about to take root. There were affirmations with these proposals that women would lead the way in this transformation and would serve as invaluable agents in ushering in this transformative change. There were assurances that women would be the future face of global leadership, that they would lead both in the workplace and in their own homes, and the call began to circulate within women's spaces that women needed to start preparing for the hard work that lay ahead. Women were told to break out of the box that men had placed them into and to start seeing themselves as more than women, and to begin to desire bigger things for themselves. Women were told that bigger things were on the way. In certain circles, there were assurances that women would receive thorough training for the task at hand and would be the beneficiaries of cutting-edge mentorship programs in regards to everything from starting a business, running for political office, or navigating the upper echelon of a particular industry. There were assurances from various organizations, institutions, and corporations throughout the country that they were devoting themselves to fast-tracking women into leadership roles. And all of this information was relayed through university classrooms, women's private online networks, and general word of mouth among women. Women everywhere were being told, now is your time. This initiative overall is what initially gave birth to the expression, the future is female. At the same time, due to the constant bombardment of feminist theory propaganda in women's spaces, a majority of young women began to perceive men as an enemy and began to regard men as the guardians of a system that oppresses women. Women began to perceive Western society as a hostile environment for women, and many women even began to hate men while growing ever more fond of the idea of stripping men from power. And indeed, the opportunity was at the door. And thus we begin our journey. Soon, social justice activism would be center stage in the West, and calls to action ranging from Me Too to the Women's March would send shockwaves across America. Now I'm going to leave you all with this quote from the UN Secretary General. These are remarks that he made for the opening of the Commission on the Status of Women in New York on March 18th, 2018. Quote, across the world, women are telling their stories and provoking important and necessary conversations in villages and cities, in boardrooms and bedrooms, in the streets and in the corridors of power, in Latin America, France, India, the Middle East, China, and here in the United States. From Me Too to Time's Up to The Time Is Now, Women and girls are calling out abusive behavior and discriminatory attitudes. And let's be clear, the central question we face is a question of power. Power is normally never given. Power normally needs to be taken. We live in a male dominated world with a male dominated culture, and that is why the empowerment of women and girls is our common central objective. Centuries of patriarchy and discrimination have left a damaging legacy. Sexist attitudes and stereotypes are widespread in governments, the private sector, academia, the arts, science, and technology, and even in civil society and international organizations like the United Nations. Women are pioneering scientists and mathematicians, but they occupy less than 30% of research and development jobs worldwide. Women are accomplished artists, writers, musicians, and filmmakers, but this year, 33 men took home Academy Awards and only 6 women. Women are gifted negotiators and communicators, but at the United Nations, the proportion of women ambassadors hovers around 20%. In our next few videos, we're going to be exploring these topics in greater depth, and we're going to be analyzing certain calls to action that women participated in from the years 2016 until roughly 2021. But in the meantime, thank you guys very much for tuning in. I pray that our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ is near and dear to every one of you. Till next time.